They look like they cost a fortune, but every one of these exciting garments was created at a fraction of shop prices using this. A modern knitting machine puts the world of beautiful fashion knitwear at your fingertips. We're here to introduce you to the creative, fascinating, even profitable hobby of machine knitting. By helping you to master the basic techniques, we can also help you get the very best out of your machine right from the start. And we're confident that once you start creating items like we've just seen, there'll be no stopping you. So what have we got in store for you? Well, this program is designed for people who have just bought their first knitting machine, and for those about to take the plunge. So part of the program examines what makes a good machine for the beginner. We'll also show you how a machine is set up, a task every new machine knitter worries about. We've devised a 12-step setting up procedure to make it as simple as possible for you. Then, when you've seen how to thread the machine and you're ready to start knitting, we'll take you through your first project and let you loose on the punch card facility. So for those of you still choosing your first knitting machine, what should you be looking for? Firstly, let's point out there are three main formats of knitting machine: fine gauge, standard gauge and chunky gauge. The vast majority of knitters opt for standard gauge. This is because the format is well served by the publishers of machine knitting patterns and uses the wealth of yarns from industrial one-ply to double knitting, which are readily available from most local shops and by mail order. These coned yarns range from the basic to the truly luxurious, but in most cases they work out cheaper than their hand-knit equivalent, and of course a mere fraction of the cost of buying the garment on the high street. As a result, we strongly recommend a standard gauge machine, as it will serve the vast majority of your knitting requirements. There's a good choice of these machines available, so make sure that the machine you choose has a punch card facility, so you can knit fair isle, single motif, tuck, slip and weaving stitches fully automatically. Also, do make sure that the most important option, a ribber attachment, is available to fit your particular model. When you've gained a little experience with your knitting machine, a good ribber will let you knit several different ribs, not to mention circular knitting and pleating. Certain ribbers even let you knit reversible fabrics. This is the machine we've chosen for our demonstration, a Toyota KS901 standard gauge knitter. It's a good example of the wide range of features you can get on a relatively inexpensive machine. What's more, it's compatible with the reversible fabric ribber we've just mentioned. It also comes with well-written, clear instructions and technical and after-sales support. All in all, a pretty good package for any machine knitter. Now, for the purposes of this program, it doesn't matter what make of machine you're using, the operating procedures will be much the same. With the help of your machine manual, you'll soon get to grips with the functions of your particular model. So for those of you ready armed with a machine, remove the lid, organise a work table and a comfortable chair, and we can start setting up. As I've already mentioned, we've organised setting up into 12 easy stages. Once you memorise the order, setting up really does become far less daunting than it looks. So on to step number 1. Clamp your machine securely to your work table. Two, release the carriage, lift the handle, and you should be able to move it freely up and down the needle bed. Step 3. Loosen the thumb screws on the carriage. 4. Attach the fabric presser, making sure that the 2 pegs fit into the holes. 5. Retighten the thumb screws. 6. Remove the upper tension unit. Insert the angled end of the tension rod well into the groove at the back of the machine so that it leans backwards. Step 7. Slide the unit firmly onto the rod with the tension wires at the back. Lower the front yarn guide and lift those at the rear. 8. Always place the wax on the pins on the tension unit so that the yarn passes easily through the machine. 9. Locate the cast-on comb. Separate into its 2 pieces. Initially you'll only need the larger section. 10. Push back the row counter lever, which on our machine is on the left side of the carriage. This operates the tripper on the row counter. 11. Put the selector comb, transfer tools and latch tools onto the tool stand. And 12. Place the 2 cones of yarn directly behind the machine so that they feed freely into the yarn guides. There you are. It wasn't as hard as you thought, was it? Your machine is now ready for threading. First, thread the yarn from the left-hand cone through the left eyelet on the rear tension guide, into the spring on the upper tension unit, under the wax, through the front eyelet, and into the eyelet on the tension wire. The yarn must flow smoothly into the machine to ensure that the tension is correct. Now hold the yarn in the clip on the tension rod. The second cone of yarn threads up just the same, and that's it. You're ready to start knitting. Unfortunately, you can't just rush headlong into reproducing that fashion sweater you've had your eye on. Do please remember that a few minutes spent knitting a tension square can save you the disappointment of knitting an entire garment only to discover that it hasn't turned out the size you'd planned. Also, your tension square is a good way of accustoming yourself to the feel of your machine at the start of a project. Right, all you need are the automatic cast-on and waste yarn. So start by selecting one of the yarns as a waste yarn and the other as your main colour. The term waste yarn is used for yarn which will be discarded later, and the main colour is the one in which the garment will be knitted, so select this yarn for the main colour of the tension square. Start with your carriage at the right, then take the waste yarn from the clip on the tension rod, open the yarn feeder on the fabric presser. Insert the yarn into feeder number 1, making sure that the yarn is well back, and then close the feeder. Now tie the end of the yarn to the clamp underneath the machine. You can check that the tension is correct by pulling the yarn down towards the cone at the rear of the machine. The tension wire should force the yarn to run horizontally towards you, but the wire itself should slowly be rising. Feeder 2 is only used for a second colour when knitting ferrule, so for this first project we can ignore it. We now need to set the upper tension unit correctly to achieve a properly tensioned flow of yarn. Since we're using an average 4-ply equivalent yarn, the setting will be in the centre. For a finer yarn, we would increase the tension towards the plus mark, and for thicker yarn, we would set it to the minus mark. Your machine may have numbers or plus and minus marks, so as a general guide, the tension dial on the carriage controls the stitch size. 0 is the smallest, 10 is the largest. Our ideal tension for this exercise is 28 stitches and 40 rows over a 4-inch 10 cm square. So to achieve this tension, we'll set the dial at number 6. Here we see the partial knit lever. Leave this set on 0. The weaving brushes, for weaving thicker yarns into the work, should be set with the levers down. The spring plates are left out unless knitting certain specialist fabrics. The needle positions are marked at the end of the needle bed. A position is the non-working position, B position the working position. Now we need to cast on our 40 stitches, so take your needle selector from the accessory box. You'll notice that it has 2 different sides, one straight and one serrated. With a serrated side, push forward every other needle from A to E position. Start this selection from the 20th needle on the right side, ending at the 20th needle on the left side. Slide the carriage from right to left. You'll find that the needles in the E position have knitted back to position B, collecting the yarn in the needle hooks in the process. We will also need the pattern dial, the part of the machine which controls the knitting functions. This should be set to plain. Now take the small section of the cast-on comb and hook it onto the loops between the sinker hooks at the front of the needle bed. It's important to make sure that the cast-on comb is right in the middle. Bring the needles in A position forward to B position and then knit 10 rows in your waste yarn. Change over to your main yarn knit another 20 rows then mark stitch number 15 at each side of naught, like this. Knit a further 20 rows change back to the waste yarn and knit 10 rows again. Now, if you take your carriage across the work with no yarn in the feeder, your knitting will come away quite easily. Your sample must then be pulled into shape, then rested before you measure it on a flat surface with a ruler. Measure the 28 stitches between the markers and the 40 rows between the sections of waste yarn. If this measures 4 inches or 10 centimetres square, the tension is correct to knit the garment. If not, try again at different tensions until the measurement is correct. So at last we can start our first piece of creative work. Knitting this mitten will introduce, on a manageable scale, most of the skills you'll need to create the larger, more impressive garments. Again, set the tension dial at 6 to suit 4-ply equivalent yarn. And set the pattern dial. For our mitten we'll be using the plain setting and another method of casting on. Start with your carriage on the right. Bring forward to B position 34 needles on each side of the centre knot. And then push back to A position every 3rd needle. Thread the waste yarn, which will be removed later, and take your carriage across to the left. Hang the nylon cord carefully across the stitches between the needle hooks and the sinker hooks. Take the ends between the sinker hooks at the edges of the work and pull them down tightly beneath the bed with one hand while taking the carriage across to the right. Make sure that all the stitches have knitted. Knit 3 more rows and then pull on one end of the nylon cord to remove it from the work. Then knit another 5 rows. Next, take the nylon cord and insert it into feeder number 1, tying one end to the clamp. Then close the feeder. Hold the cord above the feeder with your left hand and let it run through your fingers while sliding the carriage across the work, thus knitting 1 row with the nylon cord. Your carriage is now at the left. Take the cord out of the feeder and release it from the clamp. Now take the main yarn from the clip on the tension rod. Place the yarn into feeder number 1 and tie the end onto the clamp. Remember to close the feeder. Set the row counter at 0 and the tension dial at tension 3. Then leave all the other settings as they are. Knit 20 rows, finishing with your carriage at the left. Now knit 1 loose row at tension 6, which will make a neat fold. Knit 20 more rows at tension 3, leaving your carriage on the right. Now we are ready to pick up the hem. Look at the work where the nylon cord joins the main yarn. Can you see that there is a row of loops above it? This is the first row in the main yarn. With your single-ended transfer tool, pick up the first loop and place it on the second needle, and the second loop on the empty needle. Now, missing the first needle in every pair, continue across the bed using the empty needle at the left edge of the work. Every needle should now have a stitch on it. This will make sure that there are no holes above the hem. Pull all the needles into E position, including number 35 at the right edge of the work. Bringing forward these needles will help the smooth running of the carriage across the bed when knitting a welt. The mock rib welt is now finished. So reset the row counter to 0, then set the tension dial at 6 and knit across to the left. The needles will return to B position. Continue knitting until the row counter reads 30. We will now remove the waste knitting by pulling on the nylon cord, which allows the waste to fall away, leaving a neat hem. Take 2 short lengths of waste yarn and mark the ends of the row, like this. Continue knitting until the row counter reads 54. Your carriage is now at the right. Now we will divide the work so that we can knit the back and the front of the mitten separately. All the needles on the left side of nought should be brought forward to E position. Now set the partial knit lever on the carriage to position 1. This will have the effect of holding the needles in E position. Put a claw weight onto the work under the needles 1 to 8 on the right side and move this down as required. This will help the needles pick up the yarn properly. Knit 1 row, taking your carriage to the left. We now have to decrease some stitches to shape the work. Here's a simple way to decrease. We need to reduce by 1 stitch at the beginning of every row for the next 15 rows. So take your single-ended transfer tool and place the eyelet on the hook of the end needle in work nearest the carriage. Pull the needle towards you with the tool until the stitch falls behind the latch on the needle. Push the needle back to A position again and the stitch will be on the transfer tool. Lift this with the stitch over the sinker hook and hook the eye of the tool onto the adjacent needle in work. Then transfer the stitch onto the needle. Now you have, in effect, 1 stitch less. When you've completed the 15 rows, decrease 1 stitch at each end of the next 5 to leave just 10 stitches. Your row counter should read 75, and we can now cast off. Transfer the end stitch on the carriage side onto the adjacent needle, pulling into E position with the transfer tool so that the stitches are behind the latch. Take the yarn and place it into the needle hook in front of the latch. Pull back the needle by the butt and you will find that the 2 stitches will knit off. Continue across the row until you have 1 stitch left. Don't pull the yarn too firmly though, or your cast-off edge will be tied. Break the yarn, leaving approximately 12 inches at the end of the work, and place the other end into the clip. Pull down the work, making a large loop in the needle hook. Thread the end of the yarn through this last stitch and pull it tight. This will secure the stitch and prevent unravelling. Next, remove the claw weight and set it aside. Push back the needle on the right of 0 to A, the out of work position. Now you've knitted one side of the mitten, the other side will seem much easier. Reset the row counter to 54. Replace the yarn in the feeder and secure it as before. Reset the partial knit lever on the carriage to 0. This will mean that the needles will knit back to B position. Knit 1 row. Now we will decrease for the next 20 rows as before, making sure that we pass the row counter lever every time. Your row counter will now read 75. Take the yarn off the clamp, cast off the 10 stitches that are left and secure them as before. Return all the needles to A position and your carriage should be on the right. And that's the main part of your mitten completed. When any work is taken off the machine, it should be rolled and pulled gently into shape. The mock rib welt especially should be shaped by sliding a ruler through the hem and pulling to close the rib. We now move on to knitting the thumb. To do this, we need to learn another method of casting on. Pull 5 needles into E position in the centre of the bed. Wind the yarn onto the end needle and place it behind the latch of the first needle on the left in the work position. Holding the stitches back against the needle bed, wind the yarn anti-clockwise fairly loosely around each needle in turn. Take the yarn under the fabric presser and into the feeder and close it. Set the row counter back to 0 and still using main tension, knit 1 row. Pull the needles into E position once more to help the machine knit the next one. Increase 1 stitch at the beginning of every row for 16 rows by simply bringing forward 1 needle to B position at the edge of the work nearest the carriage on each row. Knit to row 30 and then mark each end of the row as before. Continue until the row counter shows 40. Now decrease 1 stitch at each end of every row for 8 rows. Your row counter should now show 48. Leaving approximately 18 inches of yarn, break it off. Thread the waste yarn into the number 1 feeder and then close it. Knit 6 rows in waste yarn, then break this off. Now release the work from the machine. Using the seaming needle, draw the end of the main yarn thread through the last row of main yarn stitches, and now you'll be able to remove the waste yarn. Now to make up our mitten. Join the welt first. Insert the thumb section matching the markers and sew between these and the welt. Pull up the thread at the top of the thumb and sew right down this and then round the mitten. And there you are! You've mastered the basic knitting function and have a finished mitten to prove it. Finally, here's the punch card demonstration we promised at the beginning of the programme. Punch cards provide you with an easy way to knit various types of fabric and colour on your machine. Cast on 60 stitches and knit 7 rows in main yarn. Then, with the printing facing you, insert the card into the front card slot, here at the right side of the machine. Make sure it goes in straight. Now push down and turn the feeder dial in the direction of the arrow until you have rolled half of the card into your machine. Overlap the card ends front on top of back and join the ends with the card snaps. Keep turning the feeder dial until row number 1 appears above the card slot. The carriage is now at the left. Set the card stop lever to the square. The pattern dial should be set at plain. Set the card levers to C and knit 1 row. You'll notice that some needles have been selected for patterning. Now return the card stop lever to the small triangle. This releases the card so that it can revolve. The pattern dial can now be set to colour. Insert the second colour yarn into feeder 2 on the carriage and hook the short tension wire to the one that holds this colour. Pull forward the end needle nearest the carriage on each row. Hang claw weights at the edges of the work. Now, when the carriage is taken across the bed, 2 colours will be knitted. All you have to do now is continue knitting. And look, you have a Fair Isle pattern in a matter of minutes. You'll find that all well-written patterns will provide any other help you will need to incorporate the punch card technique into your garments. Your manual should also provide carriage setting instructions, which will allow you to add punch card designs to your knitting as and when you choose. Our Toyota KS901 comes complete with a good selection of ready pattern punch cards. But remember that with a little experience, you'll be able to make punch cards to your own personal designs. We've hardly had time to begin to show you how simple and enjoyable machine knitting can be, and the beautiful items which can be created so quickly, easily, and cheaply. If you haven't already bought your machine, you're now far better equipped to choose the right machine for you. And if you have, there's now no excuse for not getting down to some creative knitting right away. Once you team up with your knitting machine, the only limit on what you create is your own imagination.